John and Gene, you there?
Yep, we're here, George. Thanks.
Thanks, guys. I think this is going to be fun. John, I want you to set the stage, set the scene, sort of. 20 years ago, it's hard to believe now that people didn't know about Area 51, but, I mean, you knew about it back then. You were floating around on the edge to see whatever strange things were being test flown out there, and a few other aviation buffs knew about it, and people who worked there knew about it, but largely the world didn't know about it, and it was still a secret and was pretty much unknown in the world of ufology, right?
Right. My friends, I had a couple of friends that flew the SR-71, and, of course, I hung around Van Nuys, and every Monday morning, Lockheed would depart with their 3 constellations with all the engineers. This is in the 60s, the middle 60s. And then at Friday afternoon, the 3 constellations would come in all in trail formation and land. And those were the engineers that worked up there. And I never knew exactly where it was, except it wasn't too hard to figure out, somewhere in the Nevada test site. And the way I figured it out is I was doing some soaring out of a little place near Pahrump. And one of the guys there, we got talking about the test site, and he made the comment. He said, yeah, I've been up there, but no Area 51 stuff. And that's the first time I heard Area 51. And, of course, from then it wasn't too hard to track it down and find out that Area 51 meant Groom Lake. I thought it was the Tonopah test range, but it wasn't. It was Groom Lake.
You started poking around out there, taking photos, some amazing photos. No one is ever going to get that close again of the facility itself. I've used them in a couple of documentaries, and I guess you stumbled onto information about the existence of the stealth fighter, which is how you came to KLAS and our attention and helped us break that story.
Yeah, and of course, I still tell the story about the F-19, which was co-produced with the F-117A. The 117A was a cover for the F-19. The F-19, they built 62 of them, and it's still a secret, and people still don't believe it. And I have friends that, worked on it and saw it fly, and, of course, the Navy used the bulk of them, and some went to Israel. But, yeah, I've got those black and white photos I took in 77, and I went right down to the dry lake bed. That's when there was no guard shack. All there was a little booth, but nobody was in the booth, and we could look across the dry lake bed, and that's when I got that picture of the MiG-21 that was sitting outside one of the hangars. And if you go to the site where Special Projects is, they have that photo there, and that was set, and they said that's the only known photo of a MiG at Groom Lake, and that was my photo.
Man, no one will ever get that close again here. I'm sure that you made a lot of friends by publishing that photo or releasing it to the public. Gene, had you ever heard of Area 51 before you met Bob Lazar and John?
Yeah, I saw a young budding telejournalist named George Knapp do a program on it in Las Vegas, but that's the first I heard of it when you did that little local on-the-record television show.
You look back at it now, how far this story has gone, how it's changed, and how many people all over the world know about Area 51. It's really hard to remember a time, at least for most people, when it wasn't so widely known, when it wasn't so iconic.
Right. When Bob took us out there to see the disc test, not that we necessarily want to jump right in there yet, but it was as desolate as the place could be. We took an RV, and even in a vehicle of that size, we were just engulfed by desert and night sky. There wasn't a light or a human being as far as the eye could see. And after you broke Bob Lazar's story, I would say, what was it, about 12 months, there were actually tour buses taking, tours of people out to Area 51 to show them where Groom Lake was.
Oh, you saw my stories, but before you had talked to Bob, had you ever heard of the place?
No.
Wait, Gene, didn't you say you watched On the Record?
Yeah.
Well, George and I talked about that a year before.
Well, that's what I said when I saw you guys on the record.
All right, I'll tell you what, guys.
I had never heard of it.
We're going to take a break. When we come back, I want to get into the story of what you saw 20 years ago tonight. We're going into the break with Sammy Hagar, who can't seem to drive 55. Stay with us, everyone, for Coast to Coast AM. We're talking with Gene Huff and John Lear about what happened and what it started March 22nd, 1989, 20 years ago tonight, when they went out into the desert at the suggestion of a guy named Bob Lazar and watched a test flight of something amazing. When we come back, we're going to get into specifics about what they saw that night and what they think it represented. Stay with us on Coast to Coast AM. Welcome back to Coast. I'm George Knapp, joined by Gene Huff and John Lear, talking about the origins of the Area 51 story, how it all began. Gene, why don't you tell me how you met Bob Lazar?
Back then I was working at a place called National Appraisal Service down on Eastern Avenue in Las Vegas, and Bob owned back then, this was prior to digital cameras and good appraisal software, so real estate appraisals were still typed out, and actual 35-millimeter photos were taped or pasted in the pages of a real estate appraisal, and Bob Lazar owned the photo processing lab that serviced all the residential real estate appraisers in Las Vegas, so he was Bob the photo guy.
Well, this was before he's Bob the UFO guy.
Right. Well, he was still a pretty eclectic fellow. I mean, he'd show up for photo deliveries in a Honda with a jet engine in it, so he wasn't your normal guy. He looked like a scientist and was certainly an interesting guy, even if he owned a photo lab. And not everybody drives a car with a jet engine around Las Vegas, but certainly not in 1985.
And you were sort of instrumental in making the link from Bob to John Lear.
Right. I had seen John on the record with you and was really interested. I mean, John had a lot of UFO history. Would talk about Richard Nixon was in the know, and the late Jackie Gleason had a house shaped like a UFO in Florida or something like that. Did I remember that right, John?
Yeah. He was a big collector of UFO memorabilia.
Mm-hmm. And it's just strange how it happened. I had talked to Bob, and Bob's then wife Tracy, whose father was still working down at Los Alamos. He worked on the explosives that implode and compress the atomic material in atomic bombs. So he actually worked on implosions down at Los Alamos, and so I had first talked to Tracy, Bob's wife, and then she had told me Bob had worked at Los Alamos and he was a physicist, and I started telling her about seeing this guy John Lear on the record and about the UFOs, and he had mentioned that people in Los Alamos were in the know. And when Bob heard that, of course, the first thing he wanted to do was prove that he knew more than everybody else, and that he had never heard about this Los Alamos. But then when he started inquiring to some people with top secret security clearance down at Los Alamos that he knew, he found some substance to some of the things John was talking about on your show.
John, you came into the TV station, KLAS TV, where I work, and tried to interest my mentor and friend, the late Ned Day, in looking at a pile of UFO documents. And you had some credibility with the TV station because you had helped Ned and our station break the story about the existence of the stealth fighter out there in the Nevada desert, which was an awfully big story.
That was a really interesting day because Ned and I were good friends, and, I tipped him off to this stealth fighter and stuff like that. And when I told him about this flying saucer thing, he blew me off. He said, "It's not possible, John. I would have known. I didn't know you were standing right behind me." And as I started to walk out, you said, "Hey, John, but I want to see some of your stuff." And that's how it all started.
And we did a show called On the Record, and one of these shows that airs at like 6 o'clock in the morning on a Sunday that nobody watches, and it's a city councilman would be on, and there's John Lear unveiling his beliefs about UFOs and government cover-ups and things, and all of a sudden the phone's ringing off the hook, and people are paying attention and calling me up, and hey, when are you going to have that guy on again? So we had him on again, had him on a third time. It was even a bigger response, and that's sort of how I got hooked on this stuff, is that I thought, gosh, this touches the pulse of the public in a way that I had never been aware of before. I couldn't figure it out. So we thought maybe we would look into this. And in that third show, John Lear hinted that he might know a guy who was working out at Area 51 on recovered alien technology. You remember that show, John?
Yeah. And you called me up that afternoon and said, any ideas on what we can do for an encore? And I said, well, I have a friend that just got canned out there. Maybe he would want to talk. And then you set the whole thing up for that interview.
So through Gene Huff, you meet Bob Lazar. And
Gene called me and he said, I'd like to get a copy of all your tapes and stuff. And I said, well, I need an appraisal. And so we traded the tapes for the appraisal, and he brought over Bob Lazar to hold the measuring tape. And Gene and I are talking about, UFOs, and Bob couldn't have been more disinterested. He was rolling his eyes. I mean, he thought this was all just baloney. He just couldn't believe it. He said, "Look, I worked at Los Alamos. If there'd have been anything like that, I would have known."
Well, first of all, I had known Bob Lazar that long back then, so we weren't as all buddy as we are